Welcome, everybody, to the podcast Cinderella CEO, now known as C2CEO on Air. We are so excited to be on YouTube, Spotify, Spreaker, and iTunes. And so you can find us wherever you listen to your favorite podcast and even watch us live if you want to. I'm Cary Broussard, the host of your podcast, and my guest today is Dr. Rick Garlick, who's a strategy consultant with Magid Consumer Insights Company. And guess what? It's the second time that he's come on because we had so much to talk about. We're calling it part two. And the part two for our great subject matter today is the why is it so important to have corporate social responsibility? And why is it an imperative in today's workplace? Rick's background with JD Power, the Gallup Organization, and Maritz, he is an expert and I don't want to call him a nerd, so I guess I'll call him a geek. He's a research geek, but he's helped so many smart people around the world, Fortune 1000 companies, with their strategic initiatives, broadening the customer experience and the employee experience. So who better to talk to us today about the research he's done around corporate social responsibility? And he's done this research since we had our podcast about 2 months ago. So he's been busy. Welcome, Rick.
Well, thank you, Cary. That's one of the nicest things you've ever said about me.
Oh, I don't believe that, because I've said so many nice things about you, and they're all true.
You have said a lot of nice things about me, but it's really great to be back with you. I think the last time we got together, the discussion was so bountiful, if you will, that we had to come back for a part two to continue it and kind of wrap it up with a bow.
And I don't want to forget to mention anyone listening to this podcast today or watching this podcast, they are getting the first bit of news that we are actually enrolling starting today on July 21st, enrolling in a course that you and I will be teaching on corporate social responsibility. In September and October, it's a 3-part course. And if you mention that you heard this podcast today, you'll receive scholarship dollars to enroll in this course. And it's a great deal. And it's going to be a phenomenal course. And you can contact either Rick or me about the corporate social responsibility course, which is actually called Optimizing Corporate Social Responsibility. Boom. It's all up to you now, Rick. Tell it like it is.
All right. Well, when last we spoke, I think the title of our first session was Corporate Social Responsibility, the New Imperative. And some of the things that we covered were really related to the idea that corporate social responsibility initiatives are no longer nice to haves, but they've now become an imperative. And why? And the reason is that we are now moving from a model of what we used to call as shareholder capital to stakeholder capital. And the reason is that people recognize, investors and people who finance and support large organizations recognize that there's so much money to be made through the applicable use of human capital that this has now become the new focus. It's not just about making money anymore, but it's now focused on how does what you do, both for your employees, your customers, your community, how does that result in higher revenues and profitability? And if you don't have those pieces well aligned, then you're certainly losing out, and investors become less interested in you. So there's a whole new group of individuals out there that promote environmental, social, and governance, which is ESG. Some people on this podcast may have heard that term, but these are the new buzzwords and the new concepts that people are really focusing on in the business world. And if you're not focusing on those things, then you're probably going to have to focus on them eventually.
Absolutely. So it is, I guess, in terms of looking at our employees or what is important to employees, I heard today that, actually I read it today in a newsletter, Axios, that some companies are actually calling position of corporate social responsibility chief purpose officer. And this is something that I thought captured a lot of what especially the younger generation has felt about why work. Yes, we need to make a living, but I want to live my purpose. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's long overdue because one of the things that we know about people, and I've done a lot of employee engagement research, is that people really need to feel that their work is meaningful. So I just, as you were mentioning, I just completed a research study with some friends of mine where we looked at the whole notion of pride in one's work and pride in one's company. So part of what we call work pride is the feeling that you have to have some intrinsic meaning from your work, that I have to do more than just sell a widget, that I have to do something that betters people's lives so I can feel better about myself.
Yeah.
And people are looking for meaning in their work. And this is something that I think has always existed, but now that we become more of a service-oriented economy, it's now more than ever. So when I worked at the Gallup Organization, many people are familiar with their Q12, their employee engagement battery. One of the questions is, the mission and purpose of my company makes me feel my job is important. And in the work that I just did, we see that having a strong mission and having strong articulated values that people can connect with becomes a critical part of employee engagement and translates to all sorts of business outcomes. So, for example, whether people will refer their company to others as a prospective employer, whether they will recommend their products and services provided by their companies. And my favorite one is that if people were offered another job at a similar company for significantly more pay, would they still choose to remain at their current company? That's the real compelling one. And as you begin to monetize these things, you can begin to translate this whole notion to company corporate mission and values. You can translate that into significant money for the company. And
Yeah.
this is where people are coming from today.
Wow. I think that's a pretty strong argument to have a corporate social responsibility platform and also a message. But where do you start? What's the starting point for this?
Well, I think the starting point overall is to understand what the brand mission of your company is, and then align your corporate social responsibility strategy to the brand mission of your company. So
Mhm.
I think I shared the last time we talked how Sara Lee, the company that makes your pastries, used to be a partner company with Hanes, the brand that made your underwear and t-shirts and
Mhm.
socks and so forth.
Mhm.
And every day when people walked into that company, they would see a sign over the door that said, "We feed and clothe the world." And so instead of just selling pastries and underwear, you came in with this feeling that you were doing something very important. A lot of people don't know this, but for example, Coke does not sell soda products, but rather they sell a moment of refreshment. So
Love it.
Southwest Airlines sells the freedom to travel, giving people the opportunity to see their grandmas or the college students to fly home inexpensively. And when you center things around a mission that's tied in with some larger purpose and some larger social goal, you're able to then attract and engage people at a more deeper level than if you're just simply selling a product. And we've seen this recent research I've done really shows the power of pride, not just the pride that people take in their work and feeling that they're doing something important, but also the pride that people feel with their companies. So when people exhibit strong company pride, their likelihood to remain with a company, sometimes for their entire career, is about 7 times what it is when people don't feel that pride in the company. So it's not just about collecting a paycheck, it's about doing work that is meaningful and working for a company that you can feel proud to work for. And that's
Yeah.
where these CSR initiatives really become important for engaging employees in that process.
And CSR not in every case. And I was looking at a report today from Northern Trust. They did my friend Connie Lindsay heads up the CSR initiatives there, which include their diversity and inclusion efforts. And they listed the components: philanthropy strategy, diversity, equity, and inclusion, emissions reduction and renewable energy, ESG scoring methodology, and then community investments. So these are, if I was looking at a corporate or a business, just a business in general, what their top 5 initiatives are, it seems like corporate social responsibility is really gaining traction in the boardroom as well as with investors. And we talked a little bit about that last time, but could you talk a little bit about the stakeholder model with CSR?
Sure. So I think traditionally it's fair to say that what's been the subject of focus has been shareholder value. How
Mhm.
much are you driving up the stock price of a company? You know, how much value are you creating through revenue and cost reduction and all those sorts of things? People have now begun to realize that it goes beyond just simply making money for people who are investors in the company. But you now have people, your customers are key stakeholders, your employees, your investors, your partners, the people that might be suppliers to your company, and even in some cases, regulators, people
Mhm.
that come in to kind of oversee your business. And we see this particularly as an issue in healthcare, where the healthcare industry has people giving quite a bit of oversight to the way they do business. And if you're not doing business in the right way, then you're subject to potential legislation where others are running your business for you.
So people feel more connected as an employee. People working within a company feel more connected to the community as a result of their work and how they're impacting the community and also their customers. But also, what about the family members of a worker? How they see their family member, for instance, if they're working, I'm just picking a company, they're working for Athleta, which is a great company that caters to women with athletic
Mhm.
clothes. If I'm working for them and my daughter or son sees that I'm working for this company that does a lot for Olympic athletes and does a lot for, just in general fitness. Does that
Mhm.
also, did you happen to research that part of it, of how a family member might feel about somebody in their family working for that company?
Well, interesting that you would say that, because we look at something called external validation. And external validation are the people in your world outside of your coworkers who come up to you and say, "You work for a great company. How can I get a job like yours? Is your company hiring?" And that's also something that fuels the pride a person has in his or her company. And that also energizes that whole spirit of engagement that we
I
want to
love
get
that.
employees to realize. Yeah. So it's really interesting. And again, this impacts all areas of employee engagement. But I think probably none so much as retention, because when one has pride in his or her work, that pride is portable. You can take that with you. But when you have pride in your company and you're aligned with the mission, vision, values, and activities of your company, then the data that we have found shows that people are pretty much glued to their company and can't be persuaded away, even when you offer them a higher salary, because they found somewhere where they feel a fit. One other thing that we talk about, we looked at in the study,
Mhm.
and you and I have talked about, is the whole importance of values alignment.
Yes.
So, do my values resonate, and are they consistent with the values of my company? So, if my company is giving to causes and supporting things in which I believe, then once again, that increases my sense of identification with that company. So, I'm much more likely to stay there long term than risk going somewhere else where I may not feel as much of a fit or at home like I do with the company for whom I'm working.
I love that. I love that you can take questions that I'm just coming out of the blue with too. Like, I'm not throwing you any hardballs that
No.
you can't catch. So here's another one for you. We're in a different time now, thankfully. Employees are much more valued, it appears, it seems, because there's a shortage, right, of
Mhm.
good workers. So let's just back, 10 years ago during the recession, maybe that was longer now at this point, but people were laid off. They felt pride in their company, right?
Mhm.
And so when you're laid off from a company and you have pride at that connection, then that's a commitment. It's a sense of identity. Do you think human resources officers and human resources, or just general management, can also learn from this to, you know workers are people. They're not just numbers. And when you think about somebody being engaged and connected into your company, you've got to be careful about hiring too, because you're making a commitment, they're making a commitment to you. And so it's a relationship.
Well, when you look at how people have handled the pandemic, there were some CEOs that cut their pay to zero. Some CEOs kept their full pay and laid people off. And that's the kind of thing that also translates to either a positive feeling about the culture or a negative feeling about the culture. You mentioned 10 years ago, and I've been doing this employee engagement research longer than maybe I like to admit, but 10 years ago, what we saw very, very low trust, particularly in senior leadership. And if you think back to what was going
Mm.
on at the time, there were all these corporate scandals, WorldCom, Tyco, Enron, where essentially all these CEOs were getting rich off the backs of their employees and their investors.
Yeah.
And, that there was so much shady stuff going on that nobody trusted their leader. And that's another key piece of employee engagement. Do I trust my leader? Is he or she ethical and honest? And again, it all ties CSR, ethics, integrity, all those things tie into this whole notion we're talking about of stakeholder capitalism. Because
Yes.
when you look at the evaluative measures that have been set up to evaluate stakeholder capitalism, they take all these things into account because all of these things has a potential impact on the bottom line. And so again, it's not just simply looking at how is our stock price doing, but now it's looking at a whole other series of variables that potentially impact the business on a social level, not just simply on a monetary level.
Right, right. And I know you're aware of this, the conscious capitalism movement that John Mackey and Raj Sisodia captured in their book Conscious Capitalism, and the impact of these companies that have practiced conscious capitalism. Got the Container Store, with Southwest Airlines you mentioned earlier. They've monitored this in such a way, back to your point, that the companies that have done this are more profitable uh, over a longer extended period of time, almost past that quarterly. Not so concerned about the quarterly earnings, although those are important. um, there's a long-term impact that's positive financially.
So, so let me speak to that and say that when we do these studies, it's very difficult to get actual profitability data for the companies for whom our survey respondents work. So, you'll get anonymous respondents filling this out and you don't know how their companies are doing. But what I've done, and I've used this successfully in many of the engagements I've
Hmm.
operated, is asking a question: if I could, I'd invest my own money in my company. And I
Wow.
have found the course of doing all this work that that's an excellent proxy for profitability. Because if you want to know how a company's doing, talk to the employees. They know if they're getting bonuses and salary increases, and whether they're hiring or whether they're laying off and cutting pay and cutting staff. the employee is probably your best source of gathering how the company is doing from a financial perspective. So if you use responses to that question, it's a proxy for profitability. And
Wow.
I've been able to correlate this with public stock prices when it's been available, that there's a strong relationship between profitability of how people answer that question and actual profitability. And what I have found is that the companies with a strong culture that engage in CSR, employees are 4 times as likely to say that I'd invest my own money in my company than ones that they rate poorly on these things.
Wow.
So company culture drives value. There's no doubt about it.
That is a wowsy zousy stat. And I love that you do the research around that question because I've never heard that. And that also reminds me, if people want to do their own surveys within a company to find out what their employees are interested in, I want to back up a little bit because the components that we want to talk about here in corporate social responsibility are just establishing clear values first and foremost, and then aligning those values with your business objectives, your mission. How would someone begin to survey their employees about what values are important to them?
Well, and again, I'm going to sound like I'm promoting my own business here, but I'll say this with some degree of bias that a lot of new tools have been put in people's hands, like SurveyMonkey and some of these do-it-yourself software tools. And I would say that anybody can do a survey. Whether you can do a survey correctly, there's an art to how you write the questions, how you ask the questions, how you order the questions, and certainly how you interpret the data. And there's a lot of good companies out there that measure employee experience. Ours is one of them. But I would certainly say my recommendation is if you really want to get a good read on something, there are a lot of very good professionals out there that can give guidance to that process. One of the things, as you know, Cary, I'm a chief research advisor for the Incentive Research Foundation.
Yes.
And one of the things that we survey and ask people about is within your incentive program, do you have any kind of measurement for ROI? Like, how do you know if your incentive program is actually giving you the returns that you believe it is? And most people will say, many people will say, we really don't measure that because we don't know how to measure it. And that's why, just like in any other field, there are professionals that know how to do that.
Yeah, I think I'm so glad that you made that distinction because last year we did research 200 women who had been nominated for the Cinderella to CEO awards to find out what traits were shared among these successful leaders, how they'd overcome obstacles. It was a lot more difficult than I thought it would be. Thankfully, we partnered with Texas Women's University and worked with some academics to help us with the questions, and somebody like yourself who that's their expertise, the research. So when we do the course, when we teach the course together in September and October, I look forward to you teaching some of the kind of the outline of what we need to think about if we're venturing into beginning to set a bar, I guess, if you will, to begin to measure the impact of corporate social responsibility on your company, retention, recruitment, bottom line, all the things that you've been talking about.
Well, and that's certainly one group of stakeholders. And I know that you and I in the past, we've talked about situations where companies take certain positions because they believe that those positions support their employee population, sometimes at the risk of their customer base. So they may take certain controversial or polarizing positions, and because they really believe that in doing so, they support their employee population, even though they may lose the loyalty of some customers who don't like that. When you consider that there is all these different stakeholder groups out there, one of the things that you and I will talk about in the course is looking at each of these different stakeholder groups and determining the relative impact of each of these. So understanding that for some cases, if you looked into all the things that we're monetizing in these employee studies, what's the value of having a strong brand? What's the value of word of mouth recommendations from employees? What's the values of employee brand championship, of promoting your products and services? All those sorts of things. We look at those costs and then weigh them against potential customer gain and loss. All that data is out there, or could be out there. But it's a matter of not just going into it blindly and thinking this is the thing that I should do, or doing what a lot of companies are doing, unfortunately, and that's being very reactive. An issue comes up here in the news, or an issue comes up there. Companies feel like they need to make a statement or respond to it. And in some cases, there's this expectation that if companies don't say a certain thing or take a particular position, that they're not supportive, or that there's a lot of assumptions that are made about companies that can be damaging. And so it's very hard sometimes for companies to just stay above the fray and say, we really don't want to address this issue. We understand that people have different opinions on this, and we respect all of our customers and their right to differ. There's a lot of pressure that has to be taken into account before you're even given the luxury of neutrality on some issues.
I think that's a great point, and it brings up something you and I have talked about before. Sometimes there can be disagreement around diversity and inclusion, for instance. A lot of people don't even know what it means. There's an education component just to help people really understand the value of diversity and inclusion. So if people within a company are still at different ends of the spectrum, if you will, or just not on the same exact page, it does seem like defining the values for a company that people can identify with, and it brings them together in a dialogue, in an engagement around these common values that help people see more eye to eye on issues that they may be previously, or maybe for a long time, have not necessarily agreed upon. Is that another value, or is that another benefit to having corporate values?
So let me say something that I hope is not provocative, but you and I think most of the people who are watching this podcast agree on the value of diversity and inclusion. We agree on it because we know that when people feel welcome into an organization, they perform better, they make more contributions, and you've got diverse voices and diverse perspectives. You also want diversity and inclusion because of something we talked about the last time, that you want to reflect your customer base. And you want to be, if you're going to be wanting a particular broad swath of customers, then you're going to have a broad swath of employees. However, some of the research that I did when I was a communication professor showed that we're far more comfortable with people who are similar to ourselves than people who are different, because we spend a lot of energy trying to decode, okay, if I say this or I say the wrong thing, then this person's liable to turn me into HR, or I might offend them. And so people just tend to avoid people that they're not really sure what they can and can't say. And unfortunately, I think that's one of the byproducts of what we're seeing in the workplace and in the culture, that we're living in an atmosphere of fear of getting canceled, of just saying the wrong thing. And one of the things, to tie back into the question you asked, I can give a personal example. When I worked at the Gallup Organization, one of my dearest friends was an African-American woman who, her family went way back to the civil rights movement. In fact, in the 60s, Martin Luther King and Jesse Jackson and these folks stayed with her family on some of their road trips. And she was very steeped in the civil rights issue. And, she is a African-American female, and myself as a white male. But we were great friends. We got along exceptionally well, because even though there was diversity in terms of race and gender, there was alignment in terms of the values that we believed in personally. So we believed in trust, respect, being safe, being a safe person. We respected the value of listening to someone else's opinion in a non-judgmental way, and the way we chose to communicate. All those things were aligned. So my best advice and my best guidance is, yes, pursue diversity and inclusion, but look for homogeneity in terms of the
Right.
values that are important to your organization.
Well, and I think that I'm so glad you described it that way, and you bravely brought up a situation of, people are talking about it either uh, surreptitiously or behind, closed doors. The example that comes to mind is having worked at Wyndham when we launched the Women on Their Way program, and it goes back to research, is that we did research on finding out how important women were to the business and how women travelers were growing at an exponential rate, a faster rate, women business travelers were than men travelers, and that women were willing to pay $14 more per night for their stay. And we
Mhm.
were an upscale hotel company at that point. So we took the data that showed women are willing to pay more, women are traveling at a greater rate. And the third component was that more women are making decision on travel, not just leisure travel, but corporate travel. So the meeting planners, the corporate travelers, there were women were getting those positions of authority to make big travel decisions for companies. So all in all, it became a business imperative that we had done the research on that our competitors hadn't, and all of a sudden Wyndham was able to catapult and grow the brand very fast, not only with higher paying customers but just adding more hotels. So the values with the business objectives, along with the engagement of the employees feeling pride in the work, it just seems like, I mean, I used to say this about the Women on Their Way program. It seems like a no-brainer. Like,
Mhm.
it's a win-win-win. Let's do it. Let's do the CSR thing. Get it going. It's the tipping point.
Well, CSR is a wonderful thing, and it's great to see companies involved in these activities. And I don't say this with any degree of cynicism or skepticism, but if you're doing CSR, you should be doing it for the benefit of the business. Uh,
Yes.
Companies are not charities. They're not just doing this because they care. They generally may care, but they're doing it because it's positively impacting stakeholder value through basically engaging all these important groups: customers, employees, partners, legislators. The whole list of stakeholders goes on. And all of these different stakeholder groups either add or detract from the capital that the organization is accumulating. And again, it's no longer just how is the bottom line being affected, but what sorts of things are we doing that really enhance the mission and purpose of our company on a bigger level, so that our employees want to stay with us longer, they want to be more productive. Another thing that we just measured on this study was discretionary effort. So people who really had pride in their work and their company were twice as likely to say that they gave more effort than other people. Whether they did or not, I don't know, but they
They
perceived
said they did.
themselves. And much more likely to say that I consistently go the extra mile to help my coworkers and my company. So productivity, profitability, retention, all these things that are really good for driving the bottom line. And there have been a lot of books out there and a lot of people have written about how human capital adds value to companies. And this is what people have awakened and discovered and are starting to require from the companies in whom they will make an investment.
I love it. Yeah, the investment community is definitely woken up to this in terms of, I guess, portfolio management, looking for
Mhm.
companies that have this as a priority in their uh, in their boardrooms and beyond.
Mhm.
So I guess I'm just thinking people want to have you as a professor, and they're going to have an opportunity
Good.
September, October. I really want people to consider enrolling in the course. It is a 3-part course. It's optimizing your CSR program, your corporate social responsibility program. There'll be probably 8 to 10 people limited to the course. So it is kind of first come, first serve. And this comes under the umbrella of CinderellaCEO.com if you want to go to the website and check us out. But do contact Rick Garlick. He is on LinkedIn. You can find him there, Dr. Rick Garlick, and I am Cary Broussard. You can find me on LinkedIn. Rick, is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't gotten to touch on?
Well,
so much
you
to
and
talk
I could
about.
probably talk about this for the next several hours, but
Yes.
I think the message is plan your strategy around your brand. Don't just go shotgun into your CSR approach. Because like I say, I've seen companies and looked at their websites, and they have contributed money to everything from soup to nuts. And it's one of these things where it doesn't seem like there's any cohesive strategy in their CSR branding. And and I've seen other companies do very, very good jobs who tie their CSR activities directly back to their corporate mission, vision, and values. That's the first thing. The second thing is making sure that you've identified your key stakeholders and that you've assessed those key stakeholders to understand what's going to align with their values and what's going to conflict with their values. And it may be cases like you and I have talked about where one group's values and one group's priorities are very different than another group's values and priorities. And at that point, one needs to make an assessment of which one is going to be the more important one to address. And so it's a much more complex than just contributing to a cause or developing a community chest or something like that, or joining the United Way. It really becomes much more, if you want to be active and successful, it requires a lot of thought and research that we'd certainly be happy to help out and assist in any of that strategic planning.
Absolutely. Rick, everybody needs a Dr. Rick Garlick on their team.
I love that.
To help them do what you do. You live your life in a way that reflects your values, which are so positive and helpful, and CSR is just meant for you. You need to just keep it coming. And I look forward to working with you soon and teaching this course together. And thank you everybody for listening. Please contact us soon and get enrolled in this course. And thank you, Rick, for being a great guest once again.
It's always a pleasure. And I can't wait to do more work with you. You know that you're one of my favorite people, and I'm not just simply saying that.
I know it's a mutual mutual admiration society. But hey, what can we do? We're both good people.
Yep.
We both got good values, and we work hard, and we want to help others. Take care.